on Sky News Australia. This is the Rita Panahi Show.
Good evening and welcome to the Rita Panahi Show. Coming up tonight, Labor's primary vote falls to 32%, with the latest Newspoll showing the party is drifting towards minority government at the next federal election. Senator Alex Antic joins me to address the leftist meltdown caused by his elevation to the #1 Liberal Senate position in South Australia. And talking about leftist meltdowns, we saw plenty of that over the weekend in Sydney and in Melbourne, where women's rights campaigners needed police protection from trans activists who tried to break through police lines. And it wasn't just the women's rights activists that the trans lobby were trying to intimidate. Look at this clown making an absolute racket next to a police horse. I'll be speaking to Stephanie Bastian about the madness we saw in Melbourne over the weekend shortly. And I'll also speak to a young man who is fed up with his compulsory student union fees being spent on radical neo-Marxist activism. And as always, plenty of lefties losing it, including the University of Melbourne students explaining why they hate capitalism.
I'm a socialist because I think we shouldn't be living in a world run by rich to be living in a world run by ordinary people.
Hey Bella, why are you a socialist?
Well, because I think that capitalism is a system built on bloodshed and war, and we've got to fight against it. Free Palestine.
Let's bring in Daniel Wild now to go over the day's top stories. Daniel Wild, Deputy Director of the Institute of Public Affairs. Let's start with our new Race Discrimination Commissioner, who appears to favour some races over others, saying that allegations of anti-white racism, such as those levelled against Matilda's captain Sam Kerr, are missing the point. Jurid Haran Siverman told the Sydney Morning Herald, "I do not think that anti-white racism or reverse racism is the significant issue of racism that is actually happening. And it completely moves us away from the actual problems of structural and other forms of racism in this country. We had a white Australia policy. Our positions of power in politics, media and the judiciary are still held by white people. That's the context in which racism is occurring and needs to be understood. The notion of anti-white racism is based on a fundamental misunderstanding about racism." Oh, Daniel, where do I start with all that? I read all that out, so we've given full context. We're not just cherry-picking one statement there. Can we get away, firstly, from this notion of reverse racism? Racism is racism. If you're judging someone by the colour of their skin, it is racist, whatever colour they are.
Well, it's pretty basic, isn't it? Just treat everybody as they are without having regard, as you say, to their race or religion, ethnicity or gender or whatever it is.
But now we have a new definition. We've got a new Marxist definition that is all about power structures. So you can be virulently racist and not really be racist.
Well, that's right. And today, racism is a trope. It means everything and nothing, because to people like this, Australia is, as they say, structurally racist. So we're all racist. Now, the key word to use there is we had a white Australia policy. Does he know it was dismantled in the late 60s and early 70s? I think Australia is the least racist country on earth. I'm not saying there aren't individual acts of racism that take place, but as a nation, we have done more than any other nation to be welcoming and tolerant and open. And look, I just think Australians have had a gutful of these elites continuing to call us racist. Of course, the very people who call us racist are the same people who supported the most racially divisive proposal in our lifetime, which was the voice to Parliament. So you can't have it both ways.
Well, that's right. And I think the Australian people made that clear where they stood on this issue. And it just shows you what a gulf there is between the elites, whether we're talking the media, the bureaucracy, big government and also big corporations, and the average Australian, because every single state voted no. Now, this anti-white commentary shouldn't be a surprise, I guess, when last week we learned the Human Rights Commission gave a contract to provide anti-racism resources to a group founded and owned by a social justice activist who helped spread the docs details of hundreds of Jewish Australians. I mean, this was a a shock, because you would think they would know better than this. They would at least check where these resources are coming from, who's behind it, who's profiting from it, who's putting it together. But here we are.
Well, you think so, but, you know, the Australian Human Rights Commission is anything but. I mean, they are not looking out or guarding the rights of Australians. They are an activist organisation. They were largely silent throughout the most egregious breaches of our rights, which was throughout COVID.
Exactly.
I don't remember any commissioner defending the rights of anti-lockdown protesters to have their say. I don't remember them having anything to say about the mandates and the border closures and the various restrictions on our rights and freedoms. I don't think they've said anything since. So, look, this is just another example, I think, of how this is an activist organisation, not a genuine organisation that's meant to be advancing human rights in Australia.
And yet, when the coalition were in power, they didn't dismantle it. I mean, if you don't actually act on these bodies when you have the opportunity to do so, you cannot cry about it now. This is, again, just something else that consecutive coalition governments have failed on. Now, let's go to Victoria, where police are fed up with unruly protesters. I will be speaking to Stephanie Bastian later about the trans activists we had on the weekend and what happened there. But it's not just the trans activists. You've got global warming fanatics. You've got the anti-Israel protesters. And police are saying this is an enormous waste of police resources. Since October 7, there have been 7,500 police shifts needed to cover 315 protests about the Middle East conflict alone. I mean, that is incredible, and yet there's no bills being issued. I remember there was right-wing or centre-right speakers coming to this country, and they were presented with enormous bills from the Victoria Police because protesters were going to show up at their speeches. It wasn't their people protesting, it was the people trying to shut them down, but they were punished with a bill. But these weekly protests we're seeing, Extinction Rebellion, the anti-Israel ones, the trans activists, why is there no accountability? Why are there no bills being issued for any of these groups?
Well, it's a good question, and it's becoming enormously disruptive to day-to-day life in Melbourne. You said every week, I reckon there's one a day that's happening just about. I don't understand, though. You said there's 315 protests in relation to the Israel conflict. I don't understand why these protests are happening in Australia. Everyone has a right to have their say, but I think a lot of Australians will say, hang on a minute, don't bring your ethnic tension and sectarian conflict to our nation. It's based on religious tolerance. So there's that side of it. When it comes to the Victoria Police, this is encouraging that they're calling for these extra powers. We know that after COVID, their standing in the community is at an all-time low. And what they're asking for is clearly, I mean, people are just fed up with these protesters. I noticed just very recently the Premier, Jacinta Allen, said that she doesn't want these powers to go ahead. She said she doesn't see how it's going to help things. But good on the police for calling for these powers. It's probably the most sensible thing they've done, I think, in recent times.
Oh, absolutely. And releasing some of this data about how much this is costing, how much police resources are being devoted, because this is an ongoing complaint across Victoria, across Melbourne, where police aren't showing up for crimes that are committed, property crimes, because they just can't get there, or they ask the victims to come in to make a report, and yet we've got 7,500 police shifts to cover protests about the Middle East. Now, in Sydney, the cost of policing pro-Palestinian protesters is $220,000 a week, and we even had protesters against Douglas Murray over the weekend. We're going to have him in the studio tomorrow, Daniel. It's going to be very exciting indeed. But his event at the Sydney Enmore Theatre had anti-Israeli protesters there and other left-wing agitators, and they are just allergic to free speech. I mean, how can you be protesting Douglas Murray, one of the finest thinkers of his generation? He is by no means any sort of right-wing reactionary, and yet that's how they're casting him.
Well, it just shows they're not interested in debate, doesn't it? I mean, this has been a hallmark of the left. We saw it with COVID, we've seen it with climate, we saw it with The Voice. They don't want to debate anyone. They don't want their ideas challenged. They either call you a racist or whatever else to shut down your debate, or they protest your event so that people are too scared to rock up. Most people just want to have a debate, a diversity of opinions. That's the foundation of a democracy. But time and time again, we see the left, and it's becoming more emboldened and more bolshy in their willingness to censor and shut down their opponents.
Well, because they get away with it. They're getting away with it increasingly in the courts and sometimes with the cops, with this two-tier policing. Now, let's talk about the ABC. Their new chair there, Kim Williams, is cracking down on ABC journalist activists, insisting on a podcast. If you don't want to reflect a view that aspires to impartiality, don't work at the ABC. Or Daniel, is he naive or just, I don't know, a man who loves punishment? Because he's going to find out very quickly this is a staff-run collective. If he really does want to eliminate this sort of institutional bias that the ABC has, he's going to have to make some massive changes. And is he willing to do that?
He might be willing to do it, but it's not going to happen. Like, it is a staff-run collective. You hit the nail on the head. We've seen, whether it's the managing director or the chairman, they have almost no influence as to what happens on the ground at the ABC with their editorial positions and their commentary. No one's saying that journalists can't have an opinion, but what we're saying is it's a public broadcaster funded by taxpayers. Therefore, you have to make at least a reasonable effort to showcase the diverse views of the Australian community. At least have both sides of the story on major issues. They don't do that. The only way you can fix the ABC is either through changing its funding or changing the regulations which are attached to that funding. If that doesn't happen, it's going to be more of the same.
Well, we do have a charter. They actually are breaking their charter, so they're legally obliged to be impartial. They're not like The Guardian or Fairfax or Nine, I should say, Fairfax, they don't exist anymore, or even us. They have a charter, they're taxpayer funded, so they have to be impartial, and that is never enforced. It's never enforced under coalition government or a Labor government, and we saw that with The Voice most clearly when the majority of Australians, a significant majority in the end, voted no. You look at the ABC coverage, you would have thought a no vote was a 1,000,000 to 1 shot, because it was just overwhelmingly activist yes content.
It was, and it just reflects the inner city bias of the ABC. They don't understand the views of ordinary Australians, and they actually look down upon them in many ways. They look down on the lived experience and the life of ordinary people. Look, there's deep structural issues at the ABC. The charter should be enforced. If there's going to be a charter, at least enforce it. I don't know what mechanisms there are to do that, but clearly the priority for an ex-coalition government has to be, OK, if you don't want to touch the funding, OK, at least enforce the charter so it has to be impartial.
Now, Princess Kate has finally revealed where she's been the past few months, privately battling cancer. But even this very public admission wasn't enough to quell the whinings of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. This is something Jacqueline Magnay wrote about in today's Australian. Sources close to Harry and Meghan immediately told People magazine that the pair were not informed of the Princess of Wales's diagnosis, adding that they are being left out of any details regarding Kate and that there's clearly no trust. I wonder why. Harry and Meghan did release a statement wishing the princess well. But I've got to say, they find a way to insert themselves into every story concerning the royals. For a couple who just want to live their lives privately, they do they do love contacting the media with these strategic leaks.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking of the South Park episode when you mentioned that, which was a great send-up. But yeah, it's all about them, isn't it? And that's what they don't understand. People, that's the main thing that people have a problem with Harry and Meghan, is it's all about them. Everybody's wishing Kate and the royal family all the best, and obviously the king as well with their health troubles. But somehow they managed to take that story and take that real issue and make it all about them.
And finally, Rebecca Judd has taken to Instagram to slam the Victorian government's lack of response to growing crime in her suburb of Brighton. The model and businesswoman said, "Pretty sure someone warned the government about this back in 2022 and was rubbished. They didn't care then and they don't care now. This is a Victoria-wide issue, not just Bayside." And Daniel, she is 100% right. Dan Andrews tried to bully her with old stats. So did parts of the media, to their great shame. But the latest data shows she was 100% on the money about this surge in crime. And yeah, I think Dan should come out of retirement just for an apology here, just for a quick apology.
I think so. I won't be holding my breath on that at all. But she's right. There is a crime problem in Victoria.
Oh, yeah.
And like you and I have talked about before, the issue is we're locking up the wrong people. There's over a third of those in jail are there for low-risk, non-violent offences. Now, they'd be much better out of jail and in work and making a contribution. At the same time, we've got dangerous, violent criminals on the streets. The cops aren't doing their job because they're going to these transgender climate protests and not actually dealing with real crime.
Yeah.
So this is just another example. We need wholesale reform of our criminal justice system.
Daniel Wild, thanks for your time. Joining me now is South Australian Senator Alex Antic. Alex, you've caused a lefty meltdown in the past few days after you pipped shadow frontbencher Anne Ruston to the top of the Senate ticket in South Australia. The Guardian was a tad hysterical, but then again, when are they not? The ABC's Patricia Karvelis called you a hard right backbench senator who has knocked off SA's most senior female Liberal. How dare you win a Democratic vote? And then we had this from Labor Minister Catherine King.
We've seen in recent days those opposite knock off their most senior woman in South Australia for their Senate ticket in favour of a man who's a COVID conspiracist and thinks and frankly is also a Putin apologist. Right. No wonder they're backing Russia on fuel efficiency standards, frankly.
What is it about you that scares them so much? Is it that you're a straight white male oozing toxic masculinity, or the fact that you're actually a conservative with some real principles?
Hard right, far right. I saw a great meme Elon Musk tweeted today with a guy doing a song about, how people who traditionally were just, kind of traditional conservatives are now all far right and hard right, and it's so true. I don't really know. We saw a fairly predictable meltdown from the swamp media, and you expect that, but they've got someone to take aim at now, and so be it. I mean, the reality of the situation is this was a perfectly fair democratic vote of the Liberal Party. I'm extremely honoured to lead the ticket, I have to say. It's a huge honour. I think from our side of politics, this is just another example of how we have to continue to shrug off this identity politics narrative. It's a grievance narrative. It really has no basis in fact. I mean, in South Australia alone, the last 4 legislative councils, so state upper house seats, have gone to women. That hasn't happened by design. It's happened because they were actually the best people for the job. And we go round and round in circles on this, merit-based argument. We just got to ignore it. The other thing is, Rita, I just don't care. So it's just, so they can say what they like. They say everything else. I get called hard right, far right, all those other names. Who cares? Whatever.
That is a good way to approach it, and not to play by their rules. And I think the Liberals are too often guilty of doing just that. But Minister Catherine King wasn't done with you yet. She also had this to say.
Actions like that actually matter. They matter for the decisions that are made around the cabinet table. They matter in terms of the decisions that are made around the party room. I am very proud to be part of a government that is promoting the economic and social interests of women. Those opposite have got a lot to learn.
Now, it's very interesting, all this talk about female representation and womanhood from a mob who cannot tell you what a woman is. And if you ask them to answer that question, they would be very confused indeed. But it's one thing for Labor and the Greens and their media mouthpieces to melt down over your pre-selection battle, but even some of your Liberal colleagues, Senator Jane Hume, for example, expressed their disappointment. Let's have a look.
Personally, I'm disappointed. Anne Ruston is a senior member of the Shadow Cabinet. She's an exceptionally good Shadow Minister, and quite frankly, I think that this was a mistake. But it's a mistake that is a decision of the South Australian Liberal Division. It's not a decision that I can make.
But I note, Alex, she's not so upset about a man beating 2 female opponents to win pre-selection. She posted this yesterday, congratulating Tim Wilson, who was pre-selected for the Melbourne Bayside seat of Goldstein, and beat 2 women to do that. What's your response to this selective feminism from your own side?
Well, I think, Rita, look, I mean, these are matters for people to run a commentary on if they want. I mean, if people are disappointed, I'm very happy for them to be disappointed. That's a matter for Jane, and it's not a matter for anyone other than the 200 odd members of the State Council in South Australia to be disappointed or otherwise. And that's the end of the story. Once again, it's just really not something I've turned my mind to.
All right, well, let's move on to Labor staring down the barrel of a minority government at best at the next election. If this polling holds up, the primary vote is now lower than it was at the last election. The latest Newspoll published today shows Labor at 32%, Coalition at 37% with the primary vote. Seems there's no lasting impact, no positive there for Labor with their stage 3 tax cut backflip. But what's also interesting in these numbers is the Greens polling. They're at 13%, Alex, and really they've shown us in recent months just how loony and extreme they are on everything from Israel to energy to race relations, and yet their support base seems to be increasing.
Yeah, it's intriguing, actually, and we saw a lot of that in South Australia on the weekend with a local by-election in the former Premier's old seat of Dunstan, where at the moment it's not completely counted, but they're halfway through the ballots, and the Greens are tracking at about 22%, if you can believe that. And there was a similar thing happening in Queensland. Look, I think the lesson here is Aussies are working this government out. They're not stupid, and everything's more expensive than it was 2 years ago. Food 7%, fuel 20% more expensive. All of these things, the Voice and a whole raft of other things. So we know that they're going to work out this Labor government by the time we get to the next election. But what we have to be careful of are the incursions from the fringes. So the other sides of politics, and I talked about this a lot last week. During my pre-selection, I said, listen, in South Australia, there are polls which suggest One Nation's vote is as high as 11, 12, 13% in South Australia, and the same applies to the Greens. So once again, we've been through this path a million times. The message for my side of politics is the Liberal Party needs to be liberal and it needs to prosecute those values, and we win. We did so in 2019 with the Morrison miracle election. It really wasn't a miracle as such. It was just a Liberal government and campaign that focused on winning the hearts and minds of the quiet Australians. That's all we have to worry about. You can worry about all the teal spill all you want. Every time Liberal oppositions are attached to their values, they win.
Well, yeah, 2019, we were told that was the climate change election. And we saw where that went, where the Liberals had a very different policy to Labor. At the last election, both pushing net zero, really. The Conservatives didn't have much to back there. And on that, Labor are pushing ahead with their nature positive plan. It's got a beautiful sounding name, but this is the power to significantly curb all sorts of projects, mining, housing, just about any major development, including a new hospital, all in the name of environmental preservation. But Alex, many argue this is not what this legislation is really about, preserving nature. This is what the sweet-sounding name. What is this legislation about, and why should we be concerned about it?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I mean, we haven't seen an exposure draft yet. The best you can do at this stage is getting on the website and seeing a nice glossy brochure with koalas and trees and gum trees, and the name, Nature Positive. I mean, the left are so good at their marketing and their PR. I mean, we see this time after time. Love is love. All the slogans are great. And, of course, the outcomes are not. So, look, we will wait to see. But it appears to be a fairly significant overhaul of the EPBC Act, the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, in record time. This is what governments are doing now. Labor governments all across the country do this all the time, introduce large swathes of legislative instruments with a lot of regulatory control as well. I have to say, a lot of this gets done administratively in a lot of these bills. But what it actually looks like, we don't know yet because it hasn't been consulted. Industry are saying that. None of the mining companies have been told much about it. They're all complaining about this, and it seems to be building in the background. But let's be clear, what this looks like from the outside is yet another dalliance into the world of globalism by this Australia Last government. And, we need to be on top of this. We need to be ready to call it out for what it is. By the way, the Howard government in 1999 took 10 years to consult and talk about the original incarnation of the EPBC Act. This seems to be getting pushed through in a matter of months in the winter period. So we will wait to see, but it smells like trouble to me.
Now, just before you go, I want to bring to your attention what's happening in the UK. The BBC is being accused of scaremongering during COVID, reporting rare COVID deaths among healthy adults as the norm during the pandemic, and misrepresenting the true risk of coronavirus to help boost lockdown support. Now, this was revealed at a UK COVID inquiry. If we ever had a proper inquiry here, a royal commission. I'm sure pretty much every media outlet in the country would be accused of this too, and with good reason. How are we going with that reckoning? Because it seems like a lot of people made some very reckless statements, pushed policies that were really harmful on a number of levels, and there has been really next to no accountability.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, a group of us have been pushing for a Royal Commission for some considerable time, a proper one, by the way. I mean, the Albanese government set up an inquiry which, is just clearly not going to do the job it needs to do. It just can't. So we want to see a Royal Commission. We want to see that done. I mean, the irony of this being, what's come of this has been this push for misinformation and disinformation laws, and yet most of the mainstream media were responsible for most of the misinformation and disinformation, as it turned out, and no one questioned the narrative. So here we are, and this is why this was a very significant period in Australian history. A lot of people were hurt, a lot of people were harmed for a whole range of reasons, and I will continue to say it as long as I'm here. We need a Royal Commission. It needs to be a proper, excuse the expression, root and branch. Look, I hate it, but I had to use it because I couldn't think of anything else. And look into where we're up to. And, for the good of the nation, that needs to happen. And it's got to be a serious fair income one, not just a frolic in the COVID wilderness.
Senator Alex Antic, thank you so much for your time this evening. A pro-women's demonstration turns ugly in Melbourne after pro-trans activists crashed the event. But that's not how the mainstream media are reporting it. Plus, a bumper edition of Lefties Losing It. That's next. You're watching the Rita Panahi Show. Now it's time for Lefties Losing It. Let's start with Charlie Kirk, again confounding university-educated individuals with a simple question: what is a woman?
I'm a feminist, and I don't hate men.
Okay, so you are a self-described feminist. What is a woman?
Why do you want to know?
I'm infinitely curious.
What's a man?
You're looking at one. Tell me what a woman is, since you're a feminist.
You're saying these things because you're trying to get a gotcha.
You're a feminist. Shouldn't you be able to tell me what a woman is?
I'm a feminist.
Isn't that probably important to feminism? What is the woman that you're trying to advance and protect? Isn't that integral to? Is that the whole feminist project? The war against
what a woman is the only way that you can get a gotcha over everybody else. Why is it so important to you to define things in certain categories? How does that help your day-to-day life? Like
what other categories in the human species are there besides male and female?
Well, I just think that categorization is usually unhelpful when we're trying to improve society, right?
I have XY chromosomes.
Okay.
Can I give birth?
No, you can't.
Bingo. That's why categorization matters.
Yikes. A university-educated woman identifying as a feminist doesn't know what a woman is, and they know that will be the question they're going to be asked. It's not a gotcha. They've got plenty of notice, and here we are. Now to Lady Gaga's perfect image of womanhood, Dylan Mulvaney, with this note on girlhood.
Day 58 of being a girl, and I just froze my sperm.
Now, I've been a girl and a woman for a long time now. Never had to freeze my sperm. Maybe something I can look forward to. Funny how that little lesson didn't make it to Dylan's Days of Girlhood tune. We played that for you last week. Don't worry, I'm not going to play it again. Now to Boston, where racial justice and religious leaders are demanding reparations, some $15 billion worth.
They're here to ask the religious community to atone for Black Boston's suffering and support Black reparations.
And we are coming, as Dr. King said, to get our check.
Organizers from the Boston People's Reparation Commission say they're also following up on their demand on the city of Boston for a $15 billion initial payout to begin the process towards repair and reconciliation to the city's Black community.
Oh, that $15 billion was just an initial payment. It's going to cost a lot more. And I don't know about you, but I don't remember Dr. King saying get those checks. But of course, the religious leaders are happy to play along with this madness.
We call upon this city, its financiers, and its white churches to stop the shirking, stop the lying, tell the truth, and pay what is owed.
Now to the UK, where a new sexuality has just dropped. Forget about being, I don't know, heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual, even pansexual. That's all passé. We are now in the era of the ecosexual.
Kind of. I'd say more ecosexual.
What is it, ecosexual?
Someone who finds nature sexy.
This is a growing movement that treats nature as a sensual partner, and over 100,000 people now identify as ecosexual worldwide. How a person expresses their ecosexuality ranges widely.
That was on Channel 4, in case you were wondering who is trying to normalise lefties losing it. And let's end lefties with this amusing ditty that proves if you are sensible, logical, reality-based, then I'm sorry to break it to you, but you're far right now. You're a bigot. Here is Dominic Frisby.
Polite and smart and punctual, it once was good to be. You answered for your actions, and a woman was a she. You'd stand up for your people, if needs be, even fight. But now, if you uphold such values, then you are far right. We're all far right now, we're all far right now. Peterson, Rogan, Shapiro, E-I-E-I-E-I-O. There once was a great speaker called Martin Luther King. Said character's what matters, not the colour of your skin. But conduct doesn't count now, just your identity. If you should ever question this, you're racist, obviously. Oh, we're all racist now, we're all racist now. Off to the gallows we must go, E-I-E-I-E-I-O. Worse than Winston Churchill, worse than Enoch Powell, Ku Klux Klan and Jimmy Fallon, we're all racist now.
A pro-women event in Melbourne turned ugly this weekend after counter-protesters from the pro-trans lobby clashed with police and demonstrators outside Parliament House. Not content with trying to intimidate the women attending the rally or the coppers trying to protect them, the trans activists tried to spook the police horses as well. You can tell which ones are the trans activists. They're the ones still wearing masks outside in 2024, and they tend to attack in packs. Yet a lot of the coverage from leftist media outlets are dog whistling that it was the women's rights activists who were the cause of the violence. And this included Channel 9. Look at this article. It's not until the third line from the bottom that the counter-protesters, the trans activists, are even mentioned. It's very much implied it was the rally goers at fault. The headline reads, "Anti-trans demonstrators clash with police in Melbourne." Not even women's rights activists, anti-trans demonstrators. Joining me now is Research Fellow at the Women's Forum Australia, Stephanie Bastian. Stephanie, tell me about what happened on the weekend in Melbourne and the media coverage.
Good evening, Rita, and thank you for having me on. Extraordinary scenes once again where trans rights activists turned up to threaten women with violence, break through police lines to try and shut down their event talking about women's rights. Now, you mentioned the Channel 9 article. The ABC had an article where they said 2 women arrested at women's rights rally. Now, any person looking at that article would think the women's rights activists had been arrested when the circulating footage indicates that it was in fact trans rights activists We wouldn't know whether they were women or not because the media also don't, they no longer report on biological sex. So it's extremely disappointing. These people are provided licence and coverage by many parts of the media and our political leaders. I have heard no condemnation from the Allen government, from the opposition, condemning the violence shown against women. And so these people come back each year, bigger, bolder, and it really doesn't matter what the cause is. Women's rights is just one. It doesn't matter if it's climate change. It doesn't matter if it's the pro-Palestinian mob. They are just back and emboldened because no one will call out their poor behaviour because too many people in positions of power within the media and our government support what they stand for. Therefore, they turn a blind eye to their bad behaviour.
Well, they really do have disproportionate power, influence in this country, including in the media. And I think that is one of the big problems we've got. And it's probably why we're such an outlier now, because around the world, there is a reversing of this trans ideology. French senators are demanding a ban on gender transition treatments for minors after a report described sex change operations on children as one of the greatest ethical scandals in the history of medicine. The investigation, led by a senator from the La Republicans Party, accuses gender clinics and health professionals of unreasonably encouraging gender transition in minors by mobilising social media and professional bodies to push it as a viable option. What do you make of this development, Stephanie? We've seen NHS say no more puberty blockers for under 18s. We've had changes of policy, significant changes in states across America, in Scandinavia, and yet here in Australia, we won't even have a real inquiry into what's happening.
This is great news for the children of France, Rita. It's really good to see health authorities investigating and making decisions that are in the best interests of children. And as you mentioned, it's disappointing that Australia can't even have an inquiry. It's been nearly 3 weeks since the WPATH files were leaked, Rita, and other than perhaps the Australian and some parts of News Corp, there has been no mainstream coverage at all. It should have been on the front page of the ABC, of the Herald Sun, of Nine. It should have been widespread coverage on what was going on in this organisation. Activists have outlined the course of treatment for children in this country. The AusPath standards of care document come from WPATH, and we know that they are riddled with medical misinformation and they're harming children. So the sooner that we have an inquiry, the better. I just don't understand why our government, particularly at a federal level, continues to ignore this important information, particularly in light of what's happening around the world.
The senior Australian psychiatrist Andrew Amos is arguing that the treatment of transgender identities as a pathology, meaning a deviation from good health, has fallen out of fashion, with the unquestioning dogma behind transgender medical care potentially leading to a denial of evidence that could go against the Hippocratic Oath. On treating people without being allowed to assess and scrutinise their gender identity, Dr Amos said this is unethical and it is the responsibility of psychiatrists to ensure no patients are harmed by this dangerous model of care. Stephanie Bastian, is this warning, are these words going to just fall on deaf ears again?
Well, they seem to be, as we saw with Dr Gillian Spencer. When medical professionals with experience speak up, they are suspended, they are silenced, they are ignored. At the end of the day, state and territory governments are allowing these practices to go on. They are the ones that need to inquire whether their legislation is allowing medical practices that harm children. Our secretary, our federal secretary of health, needs to be investigating whether the drugs that he's allowed to be using off-label are harming children. The WPATH files show that there are links to cancer, that there are damages to bone marrow, that the surgeries on children can come with regret, can come with harm. All of this evidence is now here. It is time for an investigation, and the longer we go, the more children will be harmed. It's extremely disappointing.
Stephanie Bastian, thank you so much for your time this evening. And still to come, an inside look at how hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of student fees are being spent on crazy woke garbage. That's after this. Welcome back. Each year, full-time students at the University of Queensland are forced to pay a student services fee, which their website says is a compulsory fee to help pay for things like sports clubs, student affairs and the University of Queensland Union. The union is saying that that $7.9 million is raised for this academic year. And let's just have a look at where they're spending some of this money. $241,000 is allocated to gender and sexuality, $74,000 to Guri Barimpa, $59,000 to environment. And breaking that down further, we see under gender and sexuality, $4,000 is going to a gender affirmation bursary, $300 for condoms and dental dams, $1,000 for belly dancing classes, $1,100 to paint pouring classes, paint pouring needs classes, goodness me, over $50,000 to queer events like Pride Ball, Mardi Gras and even body neutral beach trips. All of this in a cost of living crisis. Joining me now is economics researcher at the Australian Taxpayers Alliance and student at the University of Queensland, Barclay McGain. Barclay, a lot of this money, I've got to say, seems to be used in the interests of all students for programs that are useful for all. But there also seems to be a great deal of leftist activism funded by this compulsory fee.
Hi, Rita, and hello, listeners. Yeah, you're exactly right. You've hit the nail on the head. And I think when you point to a lot of those, you look at the breakdown, you look at $240,000 for gender and sexuality, and you look at the environmental collective. You know, we're not talking about gardening or trimming hedges. We're talking about protests against the military-industrial complex. We're talking about people protesting climate change and climate change alarmism. And sadly, this sailed through. I'm a member of the UQ Union Council, and this sailed through with the help of Labor left, Labor right, and would you believe, some Labor light Liberals teaming up with the Socialists to pass what I would call a far-left radical budget for the 2023-2024 year. So it's pretty dire for the year ahead, Rita.
Goodness me, so we've got moderate bedwetter types at the student level as well amongst the Liberals. But I've got to ask, is there any balance? Are they, I don't know, paying for IPA memberships, paying for right-wing figures to speak at the university? Is any of this money going to activism that represents the interests of centre-right students, centre students, anyone who doesn't identify as a left-wing reactionary?
To the contrary. As a matter of fact, I believe some of this money, particularly from the Environment Collective, which really has become hijacked by the socialist alternative grouping at UQ, they use that money to fund propaganda, to warn people about the threat of Donald Trump Jr. coming to Brisbane, people like Kelly J. Keane and Nigel Farage. They paper the entire university from head to toe with their propaganda. So to say that there's a welcoming platform, I suppose, at the University of Queensland is actually the opposite. They're trying to make it more hostile for people with alternative views and differing voices. So look, it's quite a dire circumstance, and I was the only one to oppose this budget that they tried to sail through, and I was actually censured for being homophobic, solely for questioning what a gender-affirming causes were. And by the way, for anyone listening, gender-affirming causes means that UQ students are forced to pay $350 every year for this Student Services Amenities Fund, and now paying for hormone blockers for students who are looking to transfer their gender, and you're locked into that. There's no way that you're able to opt out or at least, maybe pass on paying the SAF for these radical causes. No, you're locked in by virtue of being a student. So there's not much academic or intellectual freedom happening there, Rita, and it's during a cost of living crisis, as you've outlined.
No. And if it's happening at your university, you can be sure it's happening at universities across the country. It's not going to be just there. And I just wonder where the accountability is. There's all sorts of sums I'm looking at here, some of them relatively small, $500 spent on feminist movie night, but $19,000 spent on something called Queer Fest. It's just, to me, how can you justify that when it doesn't represent the interests of all the students who are forced to pay for this? Now, I want to play you a clip featuring university students from Melbourne. This has gone viral for all the wrong reasons. It's been mocked, but have a look and tell me what you think.
Hey Lola, why are you a socialist?
Well, I'm a socialist because I think we shouldn't be living in a world run by rich be living in a world run by ordinary people.
Hey Bella, why are you a socialist?
Well, because I think that capitalism is a system built on bloodshed and war, and we've got to fight against it. Free Palestine.
Hey Oscar, why are you a socialist?
Well, I'm passionate about fighting for the rights of my people, Indigenous people. That fight needs to be extended to all fights against oppression everywhere.
Hey Sam, why are you a socialist?
Because I hate that billionaires are getting rich off the destruction of our planet.
And Sam, why are you a socialist?
Because I hate that there is an apathy towards people who are suffering here and the capitalists are just getting away with it.
Hey Rita, why are you a socialist?
Well, the far right is on the rise and we need a real way to combat it.
Hey Winnie, why are you a socialist?
Because I want to fight for a world that is free of water when no one has to put into detention center for no reason.
Hey Remy, why are you a socialist?
I'm a socialist because I hate capitalism. We shouldn't have to fight tooth and nail for breadcrumbs.
Is this typical of university students in 2024? What is the climate like on a typical campus? You as a conservative, are you free to say what you think, even if it's a very mainstream opinion, or are you going to get shut down by people with fairly radical viewpoints?
You're certainly in the minority, Rita, as a conservative on campus these days. But, you can see these people. It's on show for all to see. They can hardly get through a sentence without dropping the F-bomb. That's the kind of hatred that these people have for the world around them, their circumstances. It feels as though no matter how much social progress we make in society, it will never be enough for these activists. And, you brought up the Queer Fest and the Pride Ball before. I thought the gay rights movement was supposed to be all about independence and individual rights for LGBT people. But now apparently it's all about more reliance on the government or having other students pay for their balls and their gala balls. So, it's quite concerning. And the reason why it's not just affecting university students is because a recent ATO report that the ATA have uncovered, that's my organisation, the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, we've found that it's something like $74 billion of HEX fees are now going unpaid. Indeed, one sole student has cost the taxpayer $750,000 in unpaid HEX fees. So, more broadly, Rita, this isn't just an issue that is affecting university students, but because that we've allowed HEX fees to go rampant and completely run away with no one repaying these outstanding loans, it's now starting to affect the taxpayer. Because when these loans are forgiven, it's not just that this money just evaporates into thin air, it actually affects the Aussie taxpayer. And that's why I think it's important that we're sounding the alarm on this radical left-wing infiltration that we're seeing.
Oh, you're absolutely right. We've got so many junk degrees, so many kids wasting years of university for a piece of paper that isn't going to help them get a job. It gives them false hope. It gives them this debt that ultimately the taxpayer may have to pick up. And it's just a lose-lose all around. Just before you go, very quickly, there was some research out today saying that high scores in universities have skyrocketed, gone up 200%, the number of people getting high distinctions, and the average mark now is near a distinction. Is that a reflection of how smart the kids are these days, or perhaps falling standards?
Well, perhaps a lot of students, Rita, have tacked on that if you really want to get the best mark in your course, you just affirm the beliefs of your radical left-wing lecturer or tutor. But of course, I actually do think it's part of a whole movement that we're even seeing in primary and high schools. This idea of everyone gets a participation prize, that there's no winners, there's no losers.
Everyone gets an A, Barclay. Everyone gets an A.
You get a car. It's so it's not,
everyone
it's
gets
not
a high distinction. Barclay, we've run out of time, but we'll definitely have you back on for the next expose. That's it from me tonight. Up next is News Night. I'll see you tomorrow at 11. Good night.